The camera never lies, you know, and mirrors are no better. Cheaters never win, they say, they leave your heart in fetters. Beauty's only skin deep, they say, eye of the beholder. But angels seem to spend their time looking over their shoulder. Everybody wants to disappear, everybody wants to fly. They say anyone can find their wings. Yes, I close my eyes and feel for mine. Can't run away from who I am, can't keep my pride and hang my head. Can't change the world to match my inside. Stop on a dime and change my ways. Walk through the walls out of this maze. Got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. It's time I find myself. It's time I find myself. It's time
Dear Geek with the Gab, so, guess I just have to wait now. Wait. Huh. Well, might as well get some work done. Let's see, Ah, there we go. Alright. Dear Mr. Keith, last time we were talking about your remarkable book, The Maxx, and I gave a detailed account of my thoughts of the various characters involved, whom I believe to be the only important parts of a story that is set someplace only because people have to do things in places or it makes no sense. I did have some other thoughts, though. Just a reminder that there are spoilers ahead, as well as a trigger warning for rape and abuse. While it's not necessary, a passing understanding of abnormal psychology can really be helpful in grasping these characters, who they are, and why they act the way they do. When dealing with AbPsy, the first thing to do is to define what we mean by abnormal, which is not easy. There are a lot of different approaches to abnormality, such as statistical infrequency, violation of social norms, or maladaptivity, but all of them have some sort of drawback. For example, somebody with a higher-than-average intelligence is abnormal if we take statistical infrequency to be defining. Calling into work is maladaptive behavior any way you slice it. Being a 30-something that reads comic books and discusses them on the internet is actually pretty common. But my being a mandolin player is outside of social norms. So, I'm going to propose a definition that we can use for our purposes, but preface it with the caution that I am not a psychologist or psychiatrist, nor do I advocate the armchair diagnosis of real human beings by laypeople. We can explore these characters the way we can because they are fictional, and we can actually see inside their heads. That being said, I'm going to define abnormal as meaning exhibiting one or a series of behaviors that stem from trauma or disassociation from commonly experienced reality. Using that definition, we get a look into the behaviors of 4 characters who have literally built entire worlds for themselves to avoid having to deal with this one, and ultimately decide to give up and start over rather than try to pick up the pieces they have left to them. There are a number of different perspectives within abnormal psychology as well, which are all ways of approaching people like our main cast, who are prevented from having a normal life by their inability to handle reality. Behaviorists think that our actions, including the abnormal ones, are the result of our experiences. In the nature-nurture debate, behaviorists would claim that nature has very little or nothing to do with abnormal behaviors and psychological manifestations. It's all a result of what we've been through. Of the 4 main characters, you can apply this best to Gon and Julie, both of whom have clear, distinctive patterns of trauma in their backstories that have led them to the place they are. Both are sexual assault survivors, both were touched by the rabbit incident, both continue to change whenever they crash into one another. As the story moves from the first to the second storyline, especially the 2005 segments, we see them unlearning the behaviors they had learned, with Gon repenting of his old life and Julie coming to terms with the results of her actions. The biological perspective is the opposite of that, suggesting that mental problems are a matter of brain chemistry, something we see pretty clearly in Sarah. She seems biologically tied to her lot in life, and it's difficult for her to rise above being the daughter of Mr. Gon. Her neuroses stem from her father and the genetic gifts he seems to have left her, metaphorically at least. The Maxx himself is most easily seen through the cognitive perspective of abnormal psychology. In this approach, abnormal behavior is neither the result of nature or nurture, but rather is a problem of cognition. The person with mental illnesses has it because of an irrational approach to what is in the world. Their thinking is faulty, and the way to correct that is to correct the thinking that causes mental illness. In the first story arc, we see Dave struggle with this in order to overcome being the Maxx, and then struggle again to reclaim that faulty thinking when they need him to take up the mantle again in the second story arc. Norbert presumably goes the other direction, starting as a sane homeless man and adjusting his cognition to capture the particular insanity that allows him to touch somebody else's outback. The reason why it helps to understand this is because the Maxx is weird. Very weird. Understanding how the characters arrive at and having a framework for viewing their psychoses helps to take that weirdness and give it context. Dave Maxx is insane because he can't perceive the world the way that most people can, and those bad ideas of what is in the world and how it works means that the insanity surrounding him, such as the whole issue asides focused on the cartoons that he watches or the crossovers with other image characters who exhibit abilities and behaviors that they otherwise can't do in their own books, becomes part of a predictable pattern. Understand that, and you can start to get the development of what is going on during sections that might otherwise just be confusing. Julie and Gon are easier to empathize with when you see that they are consummate victims, incapable of moving past their situations until the end. The reason why the Maxx continues to think that Julie's particular dream world is the Australian outback is that Keith specifically and intentionally linked the concept of these dream worlds to the Dreamtime, a foundational aspect of the animist beliefs of Australian Aboriginal myth. The Dreamtime is a world outside of our world where all space and time is one. It can be reached in sleep, in altered states of mind, and just before reincarnation, but after death. The first important concept to understand is that not all manifestations of the Dreamtime are the same. Each region, tribe, and sometimes individual has their own dreaming, the way in which the Dreamtime primarily manifests itself. We see this later in the series as we learn that Gon has access to the dreamings of 24 people, most of which don't interest him. This also explains Sarah's reluctance to enter her or any outback. In the Dreamtime, we are one of our ancestors, and she instinctively rejects being part of Mr. Gon, her father. In fact, past, present, and future are the same thing, which is why Gon could tell Lil Julie stories of the outback that she then uses to create it so he can go there and tell her the stories that would inspire her to create it, if that makes any sense. The book series ends with the main characters inhabiting Julie's outback, but also being reborn in our world as different people who remain connected. This would be a reflection of their eternal selves, present in all-at-once time, finding one another in one thing after another time as they temporarily sojourn there. One of the things to remember about this comic is that there are a number of asides, sections where the comic goes into strange and unexpected experimental places. 3 major ones pop up, 1 in the first arc and 2 in the second. The first aside that we see is in issue 5, where the Maxx falls asleep and ends up in a dream, or possibly a dreaming, based on the cartoon he is watching as he fell asleep. Crap-on and a hats. This particular dreaming changes the art style significantly to better match the cartoon appearance that it's meaning to mimic, and Maxx is running away from his fears, represented by a group of blue creatures all named Dave. He is also carrying a fish that the Crap-on explains is his conscience and is clearly dead. At first blush, this aside seems really pointless, from him being forced to rhyme to the seemingly random images, but there is a lot here to unpack. First, the foreshadowing here is excellent, largely because what seem like random choices and images turn out to be drastically important. There's an amazing example of using every element to your advantage, to the point of implanting in the reader ideas that seem like arbitrary nonsense at the time. First, that the aside names all of fears Dave while hinging on the Max's fear of knowing his identity and possibly finding out that he wasn't a good person before putting on the mask. His fears are named Dave because he is named Dave, and his repeated attempts to avoid finding out who he really is fail because they are literally chasing him, and we, the audience, have been informed very clearly exactly who he is. This reinforced by his conscience being dead, something else he refuses to accept, and that obstinacy later saves his life. Further, when he meets little Julie at the end, we see that the Maxx is not the creator of her Outback as we'd assumed so far, but he does plant the seeds that bring her there. Little Julie informs him that this is a sacred place that even she doesn't go to, but he has clearly brought her here since, much as she would like to deny this other world, he keeps reminding her of its existence. We also get a lot of the rabbit imagery at the beginning and end, including this fantastic 2-page spread with the narration bubble saying, "and the things that could be under my mask," right next to the image of a rabbit. Dave's a nobody and the Maxx is afraid that he may be as well, but the rabbit is the heroic archetype for Julie, and he's equally scared to be a hero. The second aside is by far the weakest of them. The majority of the issue is a cartoon that Mark, Julie's son, is watching called Fred Flower and Uncle Italian Moose. It's utterly pointless, full of juvenile humor, and seems to be a parody of Ren and Stimpy, which, at this point in the 90s, would have still been considered paradigm-breaking children's entertainment. The only purpose it serves is to draw an obvious parallel at the end to the friendship of Julie and Dave Maxx, both of whom feel like they are the much-beleaguered Uncle Italian Moose in that parallel. All in all, it's not a great issue. The final aside is my favorite. It's told by Julie in issues 31 and 34. She says the story is about Megan, a young girl who tries to escape the world around her by hiding out in her local library. She's tormented by the soccer-playing girls who hang out outside and several of the boys who enter to bother her. Her grandmother's very sick and needy and continues to call her at the payphone outside the library. Since this is the Maxx, and people have quirky character traits that reveal deep truths, Megan won't go through the door that would be easiest to get to the payphone and runs through the library to try to answer before it stops ringing. The implication that she will suffer verbal abuse, if not physical abuse, doled out by her otherwise loving grandfather if she fails to answer the phone. Either way, she's guilted from all sides for not abandoning her life and dreams to care for her grandmother. Megan eventually falls in love with a new girl who starts playing soccer outside, though she can't understand why she's having feelings for another girl. This is where the door she can't bring herself to travel through comes in. Symbolically, she's rejecting an easier way, since being attracted to boys and just boys would be much simpler for her, but no matter what she does, she can't force herself to walk through that door. That makes the scene where the boys try to force her through it that much more disturbing, making a symbolic corrective rape. Despite the obvious symbolic terror, these are also some of the most touching scenes in the book, since we see all the confusion of teenage romance being played out with the added confusion of not fully comprehending her own sexuality. Megan's quirks, the way she tries to escape this world, her feelings toward her grandfather, her reaction to the soccer girls she has a crush on, it all rings very true. It's beautifully written and drawn. Julie denies that Megan is really her, though Dave Maxx doesn't believe her protests, and the reader is left to determine whether or not Megan's story is also Julie's. Whether it is or not, we get to reacquaint with Julie's empathy and see her care enough about somebody to repeat their story, to keep them alive in memory. With the exception of the second aside, these other ones take us outside of the story long enough to look back on it and gain a greater appreciation of the characters. They let us see them as vulnerable in a way that they won't allow themselves to be in the real world. Such is the power of the Dreamtime that it gives them the strength to confront their lives and come to accept them before moving on. As many of you know, MTV produced a cartoon series in 1995 as part of their show Oddities. It had its problems, but I highly recommend watching it, especially since it's currently available for free streaming on the MTV website as of the writing of this letter. The show follows the first story arc of the comic fairly well, making a few changes to remove references to other Image Comics characters, further proving that their initial inclusion was pretty much useless. The animation is close to the original and changes often to reflect the mood of the show. Voice acting is solid and all the elements work really well together. Perhaps the only problems with the show are that they only run about 11 minutes per episode and lack the context that the second story arc provides the first. It's easy to walk away from it with a lot of unanswered questions because Sam Keith didn't answer them until issues that were never animated. The ending is also very different, both from the series and the first story arc, but I liked it. It was bittersweet, ambiguous, but satisfying as you see Dave accept the world for what it is and Julie go off to presumably find a life for herself that doesn't hinge on her serving penance for a crime that she not only didn't commit, but doesn't exist. If you have some time, it's only 13 11-minute episodes, so it's easy to just breeze through and it's worth a watch. I would go deeper into the plot right now, but it really is far too much, and the second letter is already pretty damn long. More to the point, the plot is not what's important in this story. We're not here to watch these characters do things, we're here to see these characters grow because things happen around them, and the Maxx does that really well. I contend the difference between literature and hack writing is that hacks like Michael Crichton, Dean Koontz, and similar authors write fascinating plots, but they have stock characters stomp through them. They're not trying to challenge the reader to find themselves in these people, they're telling little adventures with generic people there to fill out the story. Literature, on the other hand, has plots that are reflections of the actions of the characters. When we read literature, what we're looking for are characters and either how they change or why they can't change. In that respect, the Maxx is far more literary than anything, and I love that about it. There are only two major drawbacks I find with this series, and they both stem from the same problem. It's a little too ambitious for its own good. For one thing, we're often treated to these sometimes annoying, sometimes fascinating asides, and entire issues will be dedicated to showing us things for no particular reason. Sometimes, these are interesting, like Megan's story. Other times, like Fred Flower and Uncle Italian Moose, they are pointless and irritating. I suppose being hit or miss is just something that happens no matter what you're doing creatively. The other way this ambition made it fall a little short is that it wants to talk about everything. While the motifs of abuse and loneliness run very heavily through the entire series, it also wants to discuss sexuality, feminism, crime and punishment, sexual fetishism, and a whole lot of other things that it doesn't have the time, space, or characters to really delve into. Instead, it touches on a lot of very big subjects, and while I'm glad that it opened the discussion, it gave no place to really go because we had to move on. Is the story equivalent of running through a film school lecture wearing nothing but a kabuki mask screaming, "Kurosawa is overrated!" and then immediately leaving? You just said something that could be profound, or you could be full of shit, but the statement is so vague that you can't really have a proper discussion about it without a few more details. So, after several pages of writing, Mr. Keith, I would like to say thank you for creating the Maxx. Sure, it has its flaws and its silly moments, but overall I think your ambition in this was well suited to the things you did well. You gave us a cast of characters that were lost and lonely, and you gave us a hero whose only heroic quality was that he didn't want his friends to have to feel that way. In many ways, the Maxx was a deconstruction of superhero tropes, but I think there's something to be said for a person that accomplishes nothing but not letting people be alone when they need somebody to be there for them. It was touching and heartfelt, and I highly recommend it to anyone who would listen. Sequentially yours, Karu.
Karu, there's one more thing you need to do. There's a castle down the road from you. Go there tomorrow evening and make sure you enter through the side door or you'll be noticed. It's important that you get to the room at the top. Once you get there, everything will become clear. Oh, and wear something nice. It's a formal affair. Good luck.
As long as I can remember, I haven't looked for you. I haven't looked for you all my days. As long as I can remember, I haven't looked for you. And all this while you were waiting along the way. So let this be a testimony of how far I would go to bring you home. And let each day be our victory and the sweetest time that we've ever known. Quédate, por favor, por favor, quédate conmigo. Останься, пожалуйста, пожалуйста, останься со мной. No.